What the connections world refers to is something that exists right throughout Asia, and that is very close connections that run between, on the one hand, politicians and political parties, and on the other hand, large business groups, normally owned by families and controlled by families, often dynastic. The connections plays out in a variety of ways, but always to their mutual benefit. So the politicians get donations to their political parties or to themselves. They get jobs for themselves sometimes, for their relations or for their constituents, and they receive other forms of support or mutually interesting transaction. The business groups get contracts, public contracts. They get access to resources, sometimes from state-owned banks, sometimes land, often permits, licenses to operate in particular sectors. It must be obvious to anyone that Asia is the great success story of modern times. How has the connections world played into it? It has allowed a cooperation, if you like, between government and business. Politicians, acting in coordination with these large businesses, have been able, in many cases, to implement development strategies and development projects that have wider benefits, not just for the business groups and the government themselves. That Asia's success has been built on a model that is really very different from that we see in Europe or in North America. It's a model where the state has played a very active role in the economy. So let's start with China. About 25 years ago, the central government allowed tremendous amounts of decentralization in politics and in finance and in business. So a lot of this played out not just in Beijing, but right through the provinces. And what it allowed was the creation of new businesses, whether it be the then nascent Alibaba or Huawei or Tencent. All of these businesses came up through entrepreneurial leaders, but these businesses developed and grew with really very powerful support from the state. The state has, in a sense, harnessed the private sector to address its strategic goals. And these may be in fintech, these may be in security-related issues, they may be in IT, they're in a whole range of sectors which the state deems strategic. India started independence in 1947 with a very close connection between the state and particular preferred businesses. For instance, the Tata group of companies, or Birla and the others. Most of those businesses were headed by family patriarchs who had supported the Congress Party and the government in the fight for independence against the British. And what they got, it was a form of compact where they got control of particular sectors, activities, and there was very, very little competition. And this was known later on as the license Raj. Tremendous inefficiencies. 15, 20 years ago, reforms started in India. The Indian government essentially is saying, we want to develop very fast, in particular by building infrastructure, perhaps in the way that the Chinese have done, and to do that, we're going to rely on business groups to do it. And the difference is that the business groups now at the top of the pile are those that are favored by the current regime. But the basic model is very similar, and there is a very close connection with respect to the strategic goals, developmental goals of government. In South Korea, Samsung accounts for about their revenues for about 23% of Korea's GDP. It's huge. One business group. If you put together the other business groups, the chaebols, it grows even more. The top 10 companies in Korea account for over 40% of GDP. Staggering. Now, is Samsung innovative? Absolutely. It's a leading edge company. It competes in international markets, which is probably the most important reason for why it is competitive. It's not just relying on protection and subsidies and a domestic market. It has to compete, out there with Apple and in mobile phones and with just about everyone else. South Korea's great success, that they understood that they could run industrial policy, but they had to run it in a way that provided discipline. And the discipline had to come from the external markets. Now, what's wrong with it? Well, you could say not much. After all, Samsung, Hyundai, other Kia, all these players, very innovative. The problem, however, is that they concentrate almost all innovation in these very small number of business groups. Anything that looks as if it's promising gets bought up by Samsung or the big chaebols. That carries itself a lot of risk. So that is the danger of the South Korean approach. In Thailand, South Korea, and Vietnam, the 10 largest businesses, their revenues amount to between 30 and 45% of GDP. This is extremely large. And even in India and in China, the top 10 amount to about 15% of GDP. So our argument is that this is, in a sense, anti-competitive. So what you get is the entrenchment of these large business groups across a range of sectors. You don't get enough entry, new players coming in, competing, and you don't get enough exit. Asia's growth in the last 50, 60 years has really mainly been about using more capital and more labor, what economists call extensive growth. Now, those margins are being exhausted, particularly in China, much less so in India, but in most of the richer Southeast Asian and East Asian countries, the ability to just grow by putting more capital, putting more labor in, is becoming more restricted. And that means that for Asia to grow in the future, it's going to have to innovate. The point of public policy should not be to just confer preference on a small number of businesses, simply because, for instance, they are part of your strategic ideas, as in China or to some extent in India. Good public policy, I think, is to try and stimulate an environment in which invention and innovation occurs across a really wide set of companies and a wide set of sectors. And the reality is, in Asia, that's not happening. Even in China, even in India. And in other, the smaller but successful countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, there's almost no innovation going on at all, really. There's some sort of process innovation, but not much, really. So I think this connections world is, on balance, probably not a very good thing for innovation. Now, that ebb and flow of ideas and companies and the like doesn't really happen very much in Asia, and that should be rectified. So we start from the proposition that radical action is very unlikely. So what are the actions that can be feasible? One is to impose extra taxes on businesses that are organized as business groups, because you will force these business groups to reconsider the way in which they're organized. Now, the problem with breakup is where do you start and what's to stop these groups recombining in due course? The second tax instrument is inheritance or successor taxes. Recently, in South Korea, which has imposed a 50% tax rate, the son of the founder of Samsung, who died a year or so ago, the tax bill that that family had was in excess of $10 billion. And this arrangement has led the current chairman of Samsung, his son, to declare that the next generation will not actually take over the management of the company. Competition policy. I don't mean by that conventional competition policy. Instead of saying we are going to look at market structure sector by sector, which is the normal classical approach, we will also look at the amount of concentration in an economy as a whole. And this, by the way, is an approach that was being taken up in Israel within the last 15 years, and with some success in breaking up, or at least breaking down, some of the Israeli business groups. Although the connections world has been really pretty good at delivering an enormous amount of growth, it's been much less good at delivering an enormous amount of jobs. But what you see right through Asia, just as much in China as in Vietnam, as in India, as in Indonesia, is that the so-called formal sector, the part of the economy which is regulated, taxed, where people have working conditions that are subject to some sort of oversight, remains remarkably small. And what are the implications of that? Well, the first is that the majority of Asians work in informal economy, very precarious work, mostly low-wage work, and low productivity work. This accentuates inequality, because if you are lucky enough to have a good job in a business group, you might be highly productive and very well paid, but you will be of a relatively small number. And the majority of people working, as I've said, in the informal, low-wage economy have low returns to labor, and therefore even income inequality is quite pronounced. To summarize, I think if Asia doesn't start to change, it'll be challenged on growth, it'll be challenged on the distribution of rewards, and it'll be challenged above all on the creation of gainful and good employment for its citizens.